Now we're going to talk a little bit about a specific theory on identity, and this is Erikson's theory. You may have heard of the name Erik Erikson before, perhaps in another psychology class. He is well known in the field of psychology, but particularly in developmental psychology, and particularly for his ideas on identity. Before I get into his his theory, I wanted to tell a little bit about a background story about Erik Erikson. I don't know what it was. Maybe a few terms ago, several terms ago, I was talking to students about Erik Erikson, and I was being a little judgy and talking about how his parents named him Erik Erikson, and that was just a mean trick to give him the same first name as his last name. And it was a student in that class who actually corrected me, and she said, "Dr. Nordling, I think there's something to this. I think I remember hearing something about his name and how there was a special story behind it." So I did some research. And the story goes something along the lines of this, that Eric's mom was somebody who was well-to-do in, I believe it was in Denmark, and she was married but wanted to get a divorce from her husband. She, at the time, wasn't able to get divorced. Again, different period of time in history. And so she was kind of separated from her husband, and she ended up having a one-night stand. And lo and behold, little Eric was born. So her first husband eventually got divorced with her. This one night stand guy was never really in the picture. He really was a one night stand. When Eric was a baby, his mom started to date this third guy who really raised Eric as his own. And it wasn't until about adolescence that Eric found out that the dad who raised him wasn't his biological dad. He actually learned that his mom, had had this brief affair, and that led to his birth. When Eric was moving to the United States, he decided to change his last name, as many immigrants did and or do. And when he decided to move, he adopted for himself the name Erikson. And the idea here was that Eric was named after his biological dad. So he gave himself the name Eric's son. The reason I think this story is particularly interesting is because Erik Erikson made a whole career about studying development, but also about studying identity. And you can imagine that during adolescence, when one is first starting to go through this process of identity change, figuring out or finding out that your biological dad isn't who you thought it was could be something that's very jarring, or make you question, who am I, or who do I think I was, who am I really? So I really like this idea because in the story, because it's reflective of reality. We're all going through these identity changes at different points in our lives, particularly in adolescence. But when we talk about researchers, developmental psychologists or other researchers, how they get passionate about their particular careers and particular research topics. For Eric, we can definitely say that in part it probably had to do with his early life. Now, his theory is a lifespan theory, and it was only during adolescence. We're talking about a particular stage. Erik Erikson's theory is a stage theory, and this is the stage known as identity versus identity diffusion. And in his theory, he says that achieving a coherent sense of identity is really pretty difficult, both intellectually, so cognitively, and emotionally. So we can't physically do this before adolescence. So this is why this stage it's occurring during adolescence. In this theory, this stage says that, well, just broadly, he believed that we have these crises at each stage that we have to overcome. And if we don't overcome a crisis, then we can't move on successfully to the next stage, or we're always kind of having problems with different areas of our life if we don't meet all of the criteria to get out of that crisis. For identity versus identity diffusion, the way that we resolve the crisis lies in interacting with others. So people do play a big role in our own identity. So for example, through other people's reactions, we can learn whether we're trait A or trait B. We can just figure out more about ourselves. How are other people seeing us? And based on their reactions to us, are we somebody who is coming off as really funny or not funny? Shy or outgoing? Really conscientious, or people kind of see us more careless? And again, this is coming from other people's reactions all around us. But Erickson also said that it's really the people who matter to us most that shape our identity or our personality. So for example, if you a person, and just imagine right now, somebody that you really, really don't like, a person you really, really don't like. If that person told you to stop behaving in a certain way, or told you to stop acting in a certain way, or told you that, that the person that you're being isn't really you, are you going to really believe them or change because of their comments? Probably not. And that's because, again, this person doesn't really matter to you. You don't like them. But let's say it was your best friend telling you about how they see you behaving, or a parent, or a sibling. It's in these cases that these people matter to us and they help shape our identity. So if they say, hey, this behavior isn't really like you, it makes us take a step back and reflect on that, engage in the process of metacognition, and ultimately in the question of who am I and who do I want to be. We learn from others what we ought to keep doing or stop doing. This goes along again with the reactions of people who matter. But what kinds of behaviors or traits are being praised? Which ones are being ridiculed or mocked, or people are just talking about it in a way that is unfavorable? We learn more about ourselves through our interactions with others.